Physical and physiological attributes of female volleyball players, a review. The Zinman College of Physical Education and Sports Science, Wingate Institute, Israel, and Department of Learning and Teaching Instruction, Faculty of Education, University of Haifa, Israel. Introduction. The development of performance-enhancement training programs for female volleyball players requires volleyball coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, and other professionals who work with the volleyball players, athletic trainers, physiothera-pists, physicians, to use empirical and practical knowledge from various sports-related domains, among them being exercise physiology and sports medicine. Relevant information on training-related issues such as physical attributes, height, body mass, fat-free mass, physiological attributes, aerobic profile, strength, vertical jump ability, and agility, and speed, and on-court data, heart rate, blood lactate level, can be effectively implemented in the volleyball programs, particularly in strength and conditioning programs specifically developed for the female volleyball player. An attempt was made in this article to integrate knowledge on physical attributes, physiological attributes, and on-court performance of female volleyball players that can be applied by those involved in the short and long-term planning process of annual training programs. This integrated knowledge can be also beneficial when these professionals assess the contribution of their programs to the development of the female volleyball player. However, a careful approach should be adopted by those professionals who work with volleyball players in the implementation of knowledge gained from studies on female volleyball players. This is to say that the methodological limitations of these studies and any measurement issue associated with the physical tests given to the players in these studies should be taken into account. The purpose of the current article is threefold: to review a series of studies, N31, on physiological attributes, and on-court performance of female volleyball players, including professional players, national team players, and university intercollegiate players. B, to discuss a number of methodological concerns and testing limitations associated with the reviewed studies. And C, to provide practical recommendations for volleyball coaches and strength and conditioning coaches who work with female volleyball players. The reviewed articles were selected from an extensive search of the English language literature, including major computerized databases, PubMed and Sports Discuss, and library holding searches. Search terms included, among others, volleyball, volleyball physiology, and volleyball players. Articles on adolescent players and those articles combining data for female and male players were excluded. 31 articles matching our criteria were included in our review. Physical attributes. A summary of the physical attributes for the female volleyball players across the reviewed studies is present in Table 1. The review data reveals several noteworthy findings. Height and body mass values vary between 164.3 plus or minus 4 centimeters, 62.5 plus or minus 8 kilograms, and 187 plus or minus 5.4 centimeters, and 75.1 plus or minus 7.4 kgs respectively. These variations in the data could be because of a smaller factors such as genetic profile of the players, their level of play, and the selection process they underwent. Physical characteristics can differentiate among players of different levels, although one study indicated no differences in height and body mass between national and university level players. Other studies showed that players of higher levels are taller and somewhat heavier than players at lower levels. In one study, the differences between players of different positions in Division A1 and A2 in the Greek National League were examined. Hitters and centers A1 and A2 centers were significantly taller in Division A1, 181.2 plus or minus 4.5, 182.0 plus or minus 4.6, and 176.9 plus or minus 4.1 centimeters respectively, compared to Division A2, 173 plus or minus 6.2, 178.7 plus or minus 4.9, and 170.9 plus or minus 4.2 centimeters respectively. No differences in body mass were found between players of the two divisions. Differences in percent body fat were found only in opposites, A1 20.5, 3%, and versus A2 25.7 plus or minus 3.4%. In this study, the physical characteristics between players and playing various positions were also compared. and it was found that liberos appeared to be smaller than in other positions, except for setters. In addition, centers and opposites were taller compared to hitters, liberos, and setters. 3 studies examined changes in physical characteristics over time. No change in body mass, percent fat, and fat-free mass were observed after a supervised off-season strength and conditioning program of NCAA Division I players. In another study, percent fat of NCAA Division I players increased and fat-free mass decreased at the end of competition phase of the season compared to baseline values, whereas body mass remained stable. In contrast, another study revealed slight decreases in percent fat throughout the entire season. Although an increase in percent fat can hinder performance, it should be noted that the changes indicated in all studies were small and could have been affected at least in part by the accuracy of the type of instruments used and the measurement methods. In addition, even if the data reflect actual changes in body composition, this does not necessarily mean that these changes influence performance. Body composition can vary over time, as Johnson et al. Suggested, and therefore a range of values rather than one strict value should be set for each individual player. Comparing volleyball players to players of other team sports and to non-athletes can shed light on the physical attributes that are unique to those players. In one study, intercollegiate volleyball players were significantly taller and had higher body mass and fat-free mass compared to non-athletes. Compared to intercollegiate basketball players, the volleyball players had shorter arms but shared similar height and body mass. In another study, physical attributes of basketball, handball, and volleyball players played in Division I in Greece were compared. It was found that volleyball players were taller, 177.1 plus or minus 6.5 centimeters, than both basketball, 174.7 plus or minus 7.8, and handball, 165.9 plus or minus 6.3 players. The volleyball players were also heavier, 69.5 plus or minus 7.4 kilograms, had a higher fat-free mass, 53.2 plus or minus 5.3 kilograms, and lower percent fat, 23.4 plus or minus 2.8%, than the handball players, 65.1 plus or minus 9.1 kilograms, 48 plus or minus 6 kilograms, 25.9 plus or minus 3.3 respectively. It is evident from these data and the data on volleyball players in different proficiency levels that being tall is advantageous in volleyball. Probably the most important aspect of describing physical characteristics is in determining whether or not they are related to success. A recent review on physical attributes, physiological characteristics, on-court performances, and nutritional strategies of female and male basketball players suggested that tallness and longer arm span were associated with the top team players, but not bottom team players in one tournament. However, this observation was based on findings from 2 studies only. Similarly, we found only 3 studies examining the relationship between physical characteristics and performance. In one study, fat content was significantly discriminant between players of the most successful, 12.2 plus or minus 2.8 kilograms, and at least successful, 15.0 plus or minus 5.4 kilograms, teams in a 1977 Invitational Volleyball Tournament. In another study, height was found to be significantly correlated with the final standings in the 1974 U.S. National Championship Tournament. Lastly, no correlations were found between anthropometric variables and spiking velocity in NCAA Division I players. Although body fat and height are assumed to affect volleyball playing performance, and although data from 2 correlative studies corroborate this assumption, scientific evidence for this notion is still lacking. More studies are needed to assess the contribution of physical attributes to actual performance. Success in sport is affected by a number of variables, in addition to the notably important one of physical attributes, among them being the physiological attributes of the players and their physiological state. Physiological attributes. The aerobic profile, strength, vertical jump ability, and agility and speed of female volleyball players are discussed. Aerobic profile. Although volleyball is a game of intermittent nature of high aerobic capacity, is still important, especially in multi-set games where maintaining a high level of performance over time is required. In one study, 32 of 15 members of the 1975 U.S. women's volleyball training team VO2 max values was obtained from a maximum incremental treadmill test where 41.7 plus or minus 3.6 milliliters of O2 per kilogram per minute for the Pan American team and 44.2 plus or minus 0.85 milliliters of O2 per kg per minute for the non-Pan American team. In another study reporting on 13 members of the 1980 U.S. women's national team and 13 members of the 1979 U.S. University Games team, VO2 max values of 48.8 plus or minus 5.1 and 49.9 plus or minus 5.3 milliliters of oxygen per kg per minute respectively were obtained during a maximal intermittent treadmill testing. In both of these studies, only descriptive statistics were provided, and hence it is unclear whether or not the differences between groups were significant. Two studies examined changes in VO2 max throughout the competition phase and the season. In one study, of the 6 starting players of the 1974 Case Western Reserve University Intercollegiate Volleyball team, postseason VO2 max values 33.0 plus or minus 2.6 milliliters of O2 per kilogram per minute were significantly higher than those obtained in preseason, 28.2 plus or minus 1.5. These values were obtained from a submaximal cycle ergometer test. Another study examined players from 2 volleyball teams of the official league of Finland. The experimental team had 3 to 4 conditioning sessions in the preseason, one of which was dedicated to endurance training, and 2 to 3 conditioning sessions during the season, none of which were concentrated on endurance training. The control team participated in only the 1 to 2 conditioning sessions throughout the season. VO2 max values were obtained from the incremental cycle ergometer test and did not change significantly in the experimental team. Free 47.3 plus or minus 1.7, 48.1 plus or minus 3.4, or the control team, pre 48.2 plus or minus 2.7, post 45.0 plus or minus 5.9 milliliters of oxygen per minute. Pardon me. The authors of this study suggested that the weekly practices of the games played during the season were sufficient in maintaining the initial aerobic capacity. Lastly, one study examined the effects of the off-season 12-week supervised strength conditioning training program on the NCAA Division I players. The endurance portion of the program included 4 30-minute weekly sessions at 80% maximum heart rate. Endurance capacity was assessed for the maximal effort 2-mile run. Initial values revealed no differences in running time between starters and non-starters. 999.2 plus or minus 44.3 versus 964.4 plus or minus 88.9 seconds respectively. 2-mile running time combined for both starters and non-starters improved significantly from baseline values. 966.6 plus or minus 56.5 seconds to the end of the 12-week program, 946.2 plus or minus 58.2 seconds. It was suggested that these running times were reflective of estimated VO2 max values of about 45 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Subsequent to this supervised program, 7 players were assessed for another 12 weeks of unsupervised conditioning. No change in 2-mile running time were indicated after the initial 12 weeks. The VO2 max values of the volleyball players are similar to those reported for basketball players, around 44.0 through 54.0 milliliters of oxygen per kg per minute. The only exception is these unusual low values reported by Fardy et al. These low values can be explained at least in part by the low level of the players and by the testing methodology, namely in submaximal cycle ergometry test. Strength. Muscle strength is an integral part of sports performance. There were several methods for assessing muscular strength and different studies as different methodologies. Hence, it is difficult to compare results among studies. 3 studies reported isokinetic bench press and leg press values at 20 degrees a second. 2 studies used the same pool of players from the 1977 University of Houston Invitational Volleyball Tournament. 1 study reported values of 40.7 and 144.5 kilograms for the bench press and leg press respectively. values presented in pounds in the original paper. In the second study, values were reported for players of the most successful versus the least successful teams in the tournament. Bench press and leg press values were 46.45 plus or minus 11.04 and 155.42 plus or minus 27.39 kilograms, respectively, for the players of the most successful teams, and 37.57 plus or minus 9.53 and 137.91 plus or minus 28.96 kilograms, respectively, for players of the least successful teams. A comparison of volleyball players, basketball players, and non-players revealed that basketball players bench press 44.37 plus or minus 10.97 kilograms, leg press 179.65 plus or minus 35.48 kilograms, were stronger than volleyball players, bench press 40.59 plus or minus 9.81, leg press 141.42 plus or minus 27.09 kilograms. And both volleyball players and basketball players were stronger than non-players. Bench press 30.59 plus or minus 8.14 kilograms, leg press 128.45 plus or minus 29.68 kilograms. Isokinetic testing was also conducted in the study comparing concentric and eccentric shoulder and elbow strength in female volleyball players and non-active women. Shoulder and elbow strength were important for spiking and serving, as expected. The volleyball players had significantly higher concentric and eccentric peak torque of the shoulder and elbow rotator muscles, but not for the concentric flexion peak torque of the elbow. The authors of this study suggested that the obtained results could be explained by the fact that during spiking and several of the flexors of the elbow are used mainly to decelerate the arm after hitting the ball. In another study examining isokinetic strength, and significantly correlation was found between the arm extension torque at 270 degrees a second and spiking velocity. Other isokinetic torque values, hand flexion, internal arm rotation, and forearm extension, did not correlate with those of spiking velocity. Although correlational in nature, these results suggest that high torque at high angular velocities may be important to volleyball players. This is to be expected because the high arm speeds are required for a volleyball spike. We found 4 studies that examined effectiveness of a resistance training program on strength parameters. In one study, the effects of a 12-week off-season training program were examined by the NCAA Division I players. The training program was composed of 4 resistance training sessions and 2 plyometric sessions each week. Baseline values showed that starters were in general stronger in concentric types of exercise than non-starters. 1 repetition maximum bench press 45.7 plus or minus 7.1 versus 38.6 plus or minus 3.8 kilograms, respectively. Starters remained stronger than the non-starters even after absolute values were divided by fat-free mass. However, no differences were found in isometric and isokinetic type of exercises between starters and non-starters. In addition, the 12-week program led to significant increases in isometric and concentric strength values. 1 repetition maximum bench press pre 42.7 plus or minus 6.9 versus 46.8 plus or minus 7.5 kilograms. Interestingly, the correlation between 1 RM values and 1 RM divided by fat-free mass was obtained to become lower as the season progressed. This may suggest that, at least in part, the increase in strength was because of neural mechanisms rather than the pure increase in muscle mass. Increases in dynamic strength were also observed during 12 weeks of an in-season resistance training program consisting of 250-minute weekly sessions. Significant increases were found in the 4RM bench press pre-40 plus or minus 2.8, post-47 plus or minus 3.5 kilograms, and 4RM parallel squat 92 plus or minus 11.1 kilograms, post 104 plus or minus 13.6 kilograms after a 12-week program. Another study examined leg extension isometric force during the competition phase in 2 groups of players from the official volleyball league in Finland. The control group participated in 1 to 2 endurance and strength sessions each week and showed no improvement in force production. The experimental group participated in 3 to 4 conditioning sessions during the preseason, out of which 2 to 3 were for strength development, and 2 to 3 sessions during the competition phase of the season. The maximal rate of force development increased significantly over 4 months in the middle of the season. However, maximal force did not increase and was actually reduced by the end of the season. This reduction in maximal force occurred after a cessation of 5 weeks in the resistance training. It was explained in the study that the overall volume of endurance and volleyball drill training may have interfered with strength development. However, it is also likely that the testing methodology, isometric strength, failed to measure changes in dynamic strength. Indeed, the players did not participate in isometric training. It is possible that different strength and testing protocols, concentric strength, would have resulted in increases in strength values. Lastly, a 6-week isokinetic resistance training program failed to increase upper body strength as measured on an isokinetic machine, but increased knee extension values as a velocity of 180 degrees a second. Vertical jump. Vertical jump VJ is probably the most relevant power testing protocol for volleyball players because it is a crucial skill in the game, in blocking and spiking. Comparing players of different skill levels can show the importance of VJ in volleyball. In one study, a 15% difference in a counter movement jump CMJ was observed in U.S. female national team players who jumped higher 52.4 plus or minus 4.5 centimeters than university games team players 45.5 plus or minus 6.4 centimeters. Similar differences were observed between female Pan American 52.5 plus or minus 6.0 centimeters and non-Pan American players 47.3 plus or minus 4.9 centimeters, and between NCAA Division I players 36.4 plus or minus 2.5 and Division III players 30.2 plus or minus 7.2 centimeters. The differences in VJ values, about 15 centimeters between the two former studies and the latter study, can be explained by the testing apparatus used to jump and mark a wall versus force plate measurements, and by the skill level of the players. Vertical jump performance also appeared to be related to success in the National Volleyball Tournament. Standing reach, VJ, and absolute jump height were correlated with the final ranking of the teams, R equals 0.44 through 0.63 during the 1974 U.S. National Championship Tournament. The authors of this study suggest that their critical height above the net exists for optimal spiking and blocking, and that the players who were able to reach this threshold have an advantage over those players who failed to reach it. However, a later study did not find VJ performance to be a contributing factor discriminating between winning and losing teams. Similar, no relationships between VJ and spiking velocity were found in a study of NCAA Division I female players. Although VJ ability is assumed to be a factor in improving volleyball play, data regarding its importance in predicting success and differentiating winning from losing teams are lacking. It is important to determine whether specific conditioning programs can help maintain or even increase jumping ability during a season. In one study, after 7 weeks of in-season heavy resistance training, a number of VJ values, height of jump, power, and velocity, failed to increase. In fact, values of approach jump and reach actually decreased from 61.2 plus or minus 5.6 to 57.9 plus or minus 5.3. However, these 7 weeks were followed by 4 weeks of ballistics resistance training with lower loads, which led to a significant increase in those VJ measurements back to baseline values, with jump height increasing to 61 plus or minus 5.6. In this study, not only did traditional resistance training fail to improve jump performance,
but power and velocity of jump values also actually decreased. In contrast, ballistic training increased the force velocity and power values of the various VJ protocols performed. Another study found a significant increase in CMJ values after an in-season 12-week ballistic type resistance training program, including CMJs and loaded CMJs, in elite players in the National Division I in Portugal, pre 34.22 plus or minus 5.9 centimeters, post 35.56 plus or minus 6.3. Counter movement jumps with loads of 10, 20, and 30 kilograms also increased significantly. Although ballistic training is important for increasing VJ, it should be performed only after a strong resistance and technique training foundation is in place. It was stressed in the study that the inexperienced players should avoid jump training with heavy loads. Instead, they should focus on perfecting their jump technique and enhancing their strength and stamina. A third study found improvement in both VJ and running VJ after 12 weeks of supervised off-season training, consisting of strength training 4 times per week, plyometric training twice per week, and aerobic training 4 times per week. Vertical jump increased from 44.7 plus or minus 5.7 to 48.0 plus or minus 4.2, and running VJ increased from 47.6 plus or minus 5 to 51.8 plus or minus 5.6. No changes in VJ performance were recorded after 12 extra weeks of unsupervised training. Lastly, one study found improvements in block jump and spike jump performance after 6 weeks of isokinetic resistance training, in which players performed exercises at both slow and fast angular velocities. Values were repeated as maximal height was reached, rather than as difference between standing reach and maximum jump height. In addition, standard error of measurement was reported instead of SD. Baseline values of the block jump 267.0 plus or minus 2.4 centimeters and spike jump 280.7 plus or minus 2.7 centimeters increased to 271.7 plus or minus 2.2 centimeters and 284.4 plus or minus 2.3 respectively. The control group was involved in volleyball practices only and showed no improvements in VJ performance. One of the objectives of strength and conditioning coaches is to improve their players' VJ performance throughout the training program. In one study, no changes in VJ values were seen in players who trained for endurance and strength 1 to 2 times per week throughout the entire season. In contrast, VJ values increased in groups of players who trained for endurance and strength 3 to 4 times per week and during the first competition phase of their program. When strength training was interrupted for the last 5 weeks of the second competition phase, VJ decreased.
Agility and speed. Agility and speed are integral aspects of almost every defensive and offensive maneuver performed by volleyball players. Various types of agility and speed test protocols are available, and therefore comparisons among studies can be difficult. Researchers are advised to consider specificity when choosing a test protocol from the ones available in the literature. 2 studies examined the effects of strength and conditioning programs on agility and speed in female volleyball players. In one study, NCAA Division I starters and non-starters underwent 12 weeks of an off-season conditioning program that included 4 weekly strength training sessions, 2 weekly plyometric sessions, and 4 weekly endurance sections, 30-minute runs at about 80% of maximum heart rate. Speed tests included 10 yards, 9.1 meters, and 40 yards, 36.6 meters runs. AT test running forward for 9.1 meters, shuffle left or right for 4.6 meters, shuffling to the other side for 9.1 meters, shuffling back 4.6, and back pedaling for 9.1 again, was used to test the player's agility. Running times were measured by a handheld stopwatch. These tests were performed 2 weeks into the 12-week program and at the end of the program. The results indicated that starters performed better on the 40-yard, 36.6 meter sprint compared to non-starters, 5.56 plus or minus 0.23 versus 5.84 plus or minus 0.24 seconds respectively. However, no differences were found between starters and non-starters in the 10-yard, 9.1 meter run, 1.55 plus or minus 0.42 versus 1.84 plus or minus 0.09 seconds respectively. And the agility t-test, 10.78 plus or minus 0.19 versus 11.04 plus or minus 0.44 seconds. Pooled data for both starters and non-starters revealed that the 12-week conditioning program actually reduced performance in the agility t-test, pre 10.87 plus or minus 0.34 seconds, post 11.16 plus or minus 0.38 seconds, whereas no changes were observed in the 10-yard pre 1.67 plus or minus 0.35 seconds, post 1.82 plus or minus 0.07 seconds, and 40-yard pre 5.67 plus or minus 0.28 seconds, post 5.62 plus or minus 0.24 seconds sprints. The authors suggested that these values probably reflected the lack of speed and agility drills during the 12-week program, that most likely strength and plyometric training alone cannot improve agility and speed. Another study examined the effectiveness of 2 weeks of preseason conditioning in 2 consecutive seasons, 2004, 2005, and 2005 through 2006, in NCAA Division I volleyball players. The 2004 through 2005 preseason included 24 practice sessions, 12 strength training sessions, and 2 rest days within 2 weeks. The 2005 through 6 preseason included 12 practice sessions, 10 strength training sessions, and 1 rest day within 2 weeks. An agility t-test was performed before the preseason, after the preseason, and at the end of the season's competition phase. The t-test was performed on half of a volleyball court, running lengths similar to those described in the study by Fry et al. Described in the 4 through 5 season. T-test performed deteriorated from baseline values, 10.12 plus or minus 0.5 seconds by the end of the preseason, 10.33 plus or minus 0.7 seconds, but returned to baseline values by the end of the competition phase of the season, 9.79 plus or minus 0.5 seconds. In contrast, during the 2005 through 6 season, t-test performed improved significantly at the end of the preseason, 9.69 plus or minus 0.6 seconds compared to the baseline values, 10.01 plus or minus 0.6 seconds compared to the baseline values, 10.01 plus or minus 0.6, and continued to improve towards the end of the competition phase of the season, 9.17 plus or minus 0.8 seconds. These data suggested that athletes may have been overly fatigued after the 04-05 preseasons, which indicated the 24 practice sessions and 12 strength training sessions in the 05 through 06 season, even though 7 fewer practices and 2 fewer strength training sessions were conducted. The athletes' performance improved. The intensity of the preseason program can result in the imbalance between training load and recovery. Coaches should understand that too much training can lead to reduced performance. Specifically, volleyball coaches and strength and conditioning coaches should be aware of the concepts of functional overreaching, non-functional overreaching, and overtraining. Functional overreaching is a state in which reduced performance because of training stress eventually leads to the improvement in performance after recovery. Non-functional overreaching is a state in which the training load is greater than the recovery allowed and performance is reduced for a short term, usually without physiological and psychological signs. Lastly, overtraining is a state in which the increased accumulation of training with inadequate recovery leads to long-term reduced performance accompanied by physiological and psychological maladaptations. Similar values of a 20-yard, a 18.3 meter dash were found in 3 studies. 3.05 plus or minus 0.17 seconds in the 180 collegiate players, and 3.12 plus or minus 0.13 seconds for 15 members of the 1975 U.S. women's volleyball training team, and 2.98 seconds versus the 3.14 seconds in the most successful versus the least successful players in the 1977 University of Houston Invitational Volleyball Tournament. In the latter study, 20-yard dash values were reported separately for the first 10 yards and for the next 10 to 20 yards.
Other sprint times reported were 1.05 plus or minus 0.05 seconds for a 5-meter dash, and 1.68 plus or minus 0.095 seconds for the 10-yard dash. Also, in the study, comparison between volleyball and basketball players was made. It was found that basketball players were slower, 1.72 plus or minus 0.1 seconds, than volleyball players. Both volleyball and basketball players were faster than non-athletes, 1.88 plus or minus 0.13 seconds. One study used a unique testing apparatus that was made of a 6-meter by 1-meter platform with a built-in force platform. 29 NCAA Division I through III players ran 5 meters back and forth 4 times, starting and ending on the force platform. No differences in running times were found between Division I through III players. Agility running times correlated significantly with CMG heights, R equals negative 0.58. In fact, jump height explained 34% of the variance in agility running times. Lastly, a discriminant analysis evaluating factors that differentiated the winning teams from the losing teams of these divisions found agility to be an important discriminator. On-court performance. Physiological variables such as heart rate and blood lactate should be measured under field conditions so that coaches can be provided with relevant information on the physical demands of the volleyball game. Information on patterns of movement and actions performed by volleyball players during the game should also be collected and analyzed. These measurements refer to notational analysis or time motion analysis, which are used to quantify the number and types of movements performed by the players during a game. Unfortunately, we found no studies using time motion analysis, but 2 studies examining on-court physiological variables were discovered. Time motion analysis in men's volleyball reveals the most rallies last less than 12 seconds, with a range of 3 through 40 seconds. Rest periods between rallies were also 12 seconds or less, although it is appealing to think that volleyball rallies of female players are similar to those of male players. This cannot be known without performing time motion analysis in women's games as well. In one study, heart rates during volleyball practices and games were measured in 6 non-elite female players. Heart rates during practice averaged 134 beats per minute and ranged from 120 to 161 beats per minute. During an actual game, heart rates averaged 139 beats per minute and ranged from 116 through 172 beats per minute. Mean heart rate was the highest during spikes, 138, and lowest while serving, 104. For this small sample, volleyball play appeared to be only moderately strenuous, with heart rates corresponding to 55 through 60% of VO2 max. In another study, lactate concentrations were measured in players from the first German league in 1983 through 84. Lactate levels did not change significantly from the pre to post game and remained around 2 through 2.5 millimoles per liter. It was explained by the authors of the study that during volleyball games, most of the energy requirements are supplied by phosphagen breakdown, with only a minor contribution from anaerobic glycolysis. Although this is theoretically plausible, more research is needed to understand the metabolic pathways in use during female volleyball games. Conditioning for volleyball. The use of data from on-court performance studies and from experiments examining methods of improving physiological variables can enable strength conditioning coaches to create useful conditioning programs. Although the conceptualized review on conditioning programs in volleyball is beyond the scope of this article, a short overview is warranted. A recent study by Hedrick suggested that a training program for high-level performance in volleyball must be specific to the requirements of volleyball. Exercise should be based on movements that will take place during a game. For example, lateral movements are often performed in volleyball, whereas most strength exercises are executed in the sagittal plane, and therefore coaches should include exercises such as lateral squats and side lunges in their training programs. Plyometric exercises such as the lateral box jumps and lateral bounds should also be included. In addition, dumbbell training should be considered as an important part of the conditioning program because it improves balance and body control. Also, trunk training is essential because the game of volleyball requires movements such as running, twisting, and jumping, which can create strenuous forces on the back. Usually, trunk exercises are performed in the supine position in volleyball based on the principle of specificity. Some of the exercises should be done standing up.
A strong trunk must be accompanied by a strong upper body. A strong upper body will allow for higher velocity spikes and improved VJ, and will help prevent injuries in the shoulder joint musculature, which is stressed in the game of volleyball. Lastly, training should aim at improving VJ because this is one of the most important aspects of the game. In a follow-up article, Hedrick presented a fully detailed conditioning program based on the above-mentioned principles. Methodological and measurement concerns. Based on the reviewed studies dealing with the physiological attributes, and on-court performance of female volleyball players, 3 methodological and measurement concerns are discussed. The lack of studies using a time motion analysis, and only 2 studies, were data obtained on physiological attributes of female volleyball during games, actual games. Information on what actions players usually perform during the game, such as the number of VJs performed in defensive, blocking, and offensive spiking maneuvers, is crucial in the development of appropriate training programs. As the other ball games, basketball, more studies collecting data on court performances in volleyball are required. A systematic observation of the main actions demonstrated by volleyball players during games should be carefully conducted, and an in-depth analysis of the performed on-court performances should be undertaken. By understanding the physiological demands of volleyball players during a game, strength and conditioning coaches can effectively plan their strength and conditioning programs, matching them to the specific needs of each player. The lack of experimental studies and recent reviews of observational and experimental studies on physical attributes of physiological characteristics and VJ on female and male basketball players, it is argued that more studies should encourage implementation of conditioning programs for agility and speed, for power and strength, with at least one intervention group and one control. The observation can also be made based on the current review of female volleyball players. Only 4 studies were found to examine the contribution of a resistance training program for strength parameters. More multi-group studies are needed to compare the effectiveness of the different strength and conditioning programs given to female volleyball players. The knowledge emerging from these studies will help coaches assess the contribution of different programs to the development of their players and assist them in better matching the program to the specific needs of the individual player. The use of multiple testing protocols and settings. Various tests examining physiological attributes were used in the reviewed studies, among them being agility and speed and VJ test. To compare data from different studies, it is essential to know the specific protocol and tests used in the selected testing devices and settings. In addition, norms established based on the results of one physical test cannot be used to assess results achieved in another test. Therefore, a careful selection of the testing protocol and device should be made. For example, if the objective of the researcher is to study the jumping ability of the players in spiking, then a jumping test allowing approach and the use of hands should be selected. In this study, the test should mimic the unique actions demonstrated by the player while jumping in an actual game. Practical applications. Based on the reviewed studies, 3 practical implications are suggested for the volleyball coaches and strength and conditioning coaches who work with female volleyball players. The amount of training should be carefully monitored when planning strength and conditioning programs. To achieve a high level of proficiency in the volleyball, a proper balance between volume and intensity of training is required, and appropriate rest protocols periods between training sessions. If the correct balance between volume, intensity, and frequency of training does not exist, overreaching and overtraining can occur. Although functional overreaching can lead to an eventual increased performance, both non-functional overreaching and overtraining can lead to a diminished performance for short and long periods of time. Making a differential diagnosis between non-functional overreaching and overthinking is difficult and depends on clinical outcomes. However, a key term in the recognition of overtraining is prolonged maladaptations of the athlete and of several biological regulation mechanisms. Overtraining is also characterized by diminished performance, increased fatigue, and stress. Therefore, maintaining the balance between training and recovery is essential in monitoring the player's activities during the annual training program. See a review by Musin et al. On overreaching and overtraining. The volleyball program should include ballistic or plyometric training, power training, as indicated in the current review. Traditional resistance training is not enough to improve the performance of female volleyball players, especially those that comprise VJ, blocking, and serving, and spiking. Therefore, Explosive type strength training and plyometric training in particular should be included in the training program to enable the players to improve their leg muscle power and overall conditioning program. Prevention of injuries should be considered when planning conditioning programs. For example, a suggestion suggested by Marquez et al., inexperienced players should avoid jump training with heavy loads and should focus on enhancing strength and improving jumping technique. Only after a strong foundation in strength training is achieved should ballistic training begin. In another example, patellar tendinopathy training begin. In another example, patellar tendinopathy, jumper's knee, is an overuse injury that can be caused by an increase in the volume of jump training and occurs more frequently when athletes practice on hard, unforgiving surfaces. Therefore, the type of surface on which the athletes practice is of considerable importance. Acknowledgements. The authors would like to thank the Dina Oswang for her editorial assistance during the preparation of this manuscript. No sources or funding were used to assist in the preparation of this review. The authors have no conflicts of interest that are directly relevant to the content of this review.